The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has stated that the federal government of Nigeria may need to raise a supplementary budget to accommodate the proposed minimum wage increase for workers. This is because the negotiated amount may surpass the budgeted amount in the original 2024 budget. The new minimum wage has been an ongoing matter between organized labor and the government since the beginning of this year, and I dare say even since last year, and the aim is to cushion the impact of the harsh economy. The fund also noted that the government might need to raise the domestic and external borrowing ceilings to prevent fresh borrowings from the apex banks' ways and means. Joining me to unpack this is Tilewa Adebajo, the CEO, CFG Advisory Limited. Thank you so much for joining me today, sir.
Yes, good morning.
All right, well, a new minimum wage has been an ongoing matter, really, conversation between the organized labor and government. Let me begin by asking what you make of labor's demand of 615,000 naira.
That's very interesting. How realistic that is now the issue, because how many companies can afford to pay that? I think the federal government has already increased the salaries of its own civil servants to the level at which it can accommodate. And I think we need to put reality into the equation. How many companies can really afford to pay this minimum wage? And I think in negotiations, while we understand the circumstances in Nigeria are very difficult at the moment, we're seeing a lot of increases in tariffs and taxes, fuel, especially electricity. So these increases obviously are not commensurate to any increases in wages. So clearly, I think with food inflation exacerbating the situation, it's not an easy time for Nigerians. And we all know that, yes, the Nigerian worker does deserve an increase, but the question is how much?
Maybe I should put that question back to you. How much is fair considering the macroeconomic conditions?
Well, I don't know how they calculate these things, but I think most companies have a way of paying their salaries to their staff, and the compensation is in place. And I think, most people will want to keep their staff, and basically they need to pay a living wage. And I think that's what the minimum wage is all about. So I don't have the expertise at the moment to be able to determine what the minimum wage should be or should not be. But obviously, most people try to benchmark with inflation.
Okay, so when we're benchmarking with inflation, I'm sure we're not looking at, maybe the 33 point something. We're probably looking at a year-to-date inflation figure, because if we do a 33% increase, I mean, I don't know what economists would say that would do for us. Let me get your thought finally on that before we move on.
Well, the problem with benchmarking with inflation is that inflation can also come down. So what you try to do is when you do these negotiations, you want to be able to say, well, if the government, that is why it's important for the government to bring inflation down. So if the government can bring inflation down as they're targeting inflation to about 20% within the next year or 24%, then you can begin to see that on the long run, prices are coming down. So you can base your projections based on that, not on the current rate of 33. So these are the challenges with inflation benchmarking. The target is constantly moving.
All right, well, we do not yet know how much will be agreed on, but we do feel that the negotiated amount may sort of surpass the budgeted amount in the original 2024 budget. And this might then force the government to raise a supplementary budget. Isn't this going to affect government's plan to sort of reduce its budget deficit from 6.1% in the 2023 budget to 3.8% in the current appropriation?
Well, yes, definitely that is yet to be seen, because government needs to be very careful about a lot of promises and expenditure that they're promising that they have not budgeted for. And as you said, if that's the case, then it's just going to increase the deficit, and you need to get appropriation to be able to make these expenditures. So yes, you're right. Government really needs to watch its budgets and its plan, and its pronouncements and promises and policies must be based on its budget. Otherwise, we're going to run into significant deficits. And the challenge is to finance additional deficit, including the current deficits we're trying to finance, which is currently about 11 trillion.
Well, what are the implications of, this budget deficit sort of increasing? What are the implications really?
Well, obviously, with a deficit, you need to finance it. It takes away from revenues that you can spend. and it increases your debt profile, because as you need to be able to raise money to finance that deficit. And if we're using 90% of your revenues to currently service your debt, you have to be very careful how you pile on additional debt. And of course, there's some debts that you're going to pay off this year, which will give you additional headroom. But at the end of the day, deficit financing is a major challenge for government this year. And as you know, fiscal spending has been a problem that has been recently resolved within the last 6 months. And I think that, we've seen some alignment with fiscal and monetary policy in the last 3 months. And we do not want any adverse policies, announcements or pronouncements or government pronouncements or actions that will adversely affect the current stability and synchronization we're seeing between monetary and fiscal policy. We need to sustain it.
Well, this sort of takes me to another projection from the IMF. It says that the federal government may need to raise the domestic and external borrowing ceilings to prevent fresh borrowings from the apex bank's ways and means. What are your thoughts on this, increasing the debt ceiling? Is it something you see in the offing?
Well, we can't increase the debt ceiling because there's a Fiscal Responsibility Act. And of course, I'm sure we all understand what the Fiscal Responsibility Act says, which limits government borrowing. So if you're going to increase your debt ceiling, you have to pass new legislation to amend sections of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And again, the government, I think the central bank governor has stated very clearly that there's not going to be any more ways and means financing. And the Minister of Finance has actually started to pay back or pay down some of these ways and means financing. So that's not an option going forward.
Well, many would say the challenge really isn't borrowing, but to what use the money is put. But however, now that you're saying that, we do not see that sort of increase in the offering, how then will the federal government be able to fund these deficits that we are probably going to see? And then we're also looking at, this borrowing of a thing. How sustainable is it in Nigeria?
Well, according to the Debt Management Office, they have a debt sustainability report. At least for this year, I think the debt sustainability is not an issue. The Minister of Finance has also stressed he's going to the market to do some new Eurobond issues to be able to refinance or some of the existing Eurobonds. And I think from the domestic side of things, the Debt Management Office has a debt issuance program for the year stated out already. So I think for this year, I think that's already clear. And as I said earlier, it's important that we do not have any new pronouncements or unplanned projects that will disrupt the current stability we're beginning to experience.
Well, if I get you correctly, when you're saying we should not make any further pronouncement, does that also include maybe this increase in minimum wage?
The minimum wage issue has been on the table for a long time. And I believe, like I said, the civil servants, the government has already increased the civil servants. So that's clear. So that has nothing to do with the government. The minimum wage you're talking about is for the private sector. So let's make that distinction. And I think the government has done some increase with the civil servants. And I think that has been budgeted for or pre-budgeted for. And what we're talking about now is what they want to negotiate for the private sector. So that's something that is completely different. So I don't see any issues in that area.
Well, while suggesting that higher interest rates would sort of spur banks, businesses and individuals' appetite for government securities, which of course we are saying happen now, we also understand the downside of that. What are your recommendations for sort of striking a balance here?
Striking a balance is not the issue. The issue is the fact that Nigeria is in stagflation. And stagflation means high inflation, high unemployment, and low growth. And the worst thing that can happen in an economy is high inflation because you erode purchasing power. So the priority right now is to reduce inflation. And once you can get inflation to meaningful levels like 11%, then purchasing power will improve. So this is a good time for the asset managers. This is a good time for the pension funds because they're going to benefit from people. If you're saving and you're a Nigerian who saves, or an investor who is investing, it's a good time because you benefit from high rates. When you achieve financial stability and you have a very meaningful rate of inflation, anywhere between 9 to 11% for the sake of Nigeria, that's acceptable here still. Then you can now begin to talk about, getting the balance between interest rates that will benefit both savers and borrowers of money. But right now, the pendulum is swung in the favor of people who are saving because we need to increase interest rates in order to bring down inflation. So when we bring down inflation, we'll have that correction, and that equilibrium we'll talk about, and balance will return.
All right, two things here. First, you talked about getting inflation to about 11%. And second, I'm also looking at that thought about crowding out the private sector. So let's begin with the 11% inflation. Is that achievable in the next 1 or 2 years in Nigeria?
Yes, definitely. If you take a look at the graphs for inflation trajectory in Nigeria, in 2013, inflation was about 11%, and we had GDP growth of 8.5%. So if you take a look at the fundamentals of what happened then, you can see that it's been cyclical. As far back as about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, inflation was close to 11%. Before the ways and means spending came up and took inflation to the spiral that we're seeing it now, the skyrocketing inflation. And of course, we understand that food inflation is a significant component of that. So within economic cycles, you need to be able to manage your economy so that you do not you don't have loose monetary policy that will drive inflation up, which is the ways and means financing of 30 trillion that has impacted inflation in Nigeria. So I think it's important for us to understand the course of the inflation that is currently happening in Nigeria today. It's 30 trillion ways and means financing, which is illegal, that has caused this problem we're in now. So in order for us to solve this problem, we need to increase interest rates on the short term. So the central bank is targeting 24% inflation by the end of this year. So hopefully in another year and a half or another 18 months, we should see inflation getting down to between the levels of 12 to 13%.
All right, so what about what we see about food inflation, the contribution of food inflation? What are your thoughts for also dealing with that?
Well, food inflation is a structural problem. As you know, the main cause of food inflation, apart from the fact that we've removed subsidies on fuel, which is impacting everybody, we've also increased subsidy, or we've removed the subsidy on electricity. So basically, these are price, cost push factors that are going to drive inflation up. But the key structural issue with inflation, food inflation, is that a lot of our productive farmers are in IDP camps, which is rather unfortunate. So the productive population we have that normally farm in Nigeria, because of the insecurity, are in IDP camps. So we're losing that productivity. And because we're losing productivity, our output for farming essentials have reduced significantly because of that banditry and insecurity. So it's up to the government to be able to target the resolution of the banditry issue, to allow farmers to return to their settlements, to be able to help us increase food supply in the breadbasket of Nigeria. So this is where the heart of the insecurity is. So that is a structural problem that the government needs to address head on. Then the other issues of logistics, cost of transportation and all those things can be resolved later. But the impact of banditry and a lot of our productive capacity, which is our farmers in IDP camps, is not the best.
All right. Well, again, I'd like to take us back to what I mentioned earlier about crowding out the private sector from the market. What are your thoughts about that? Doesn't that bother you?
You mean the government crowding out the private sector in terms of lending?
Exactly, yes.
Well, I mean, you need to strike a balance. The question now is yes, you don't want, there needs to be a balance on that. But the question now is, yes, everybody understands that if you do not give credit to the private sector, then the private sector cannot grow and you cannot drive growth. And government's contribution to the GDP is only about 8%, because government's budget is only at less than 10% of our GDP currently. So for an entity, which is the government, that is contributing less than 10% to the GDP, it's attracting a disproportionate amount of credit. And obviously, because the government instruments are the most secure instruments and they're risk-free. So if you get a treasury bill instrument now at 18%, then it's quite attractive because it's a risk-free rate, and most people will crowd to that instrument, and it can have an impact. So the central bank really is the one that is in the position to be able to monitor all this and to ensure that the balance between private sector availability for credit and government's appetite for credit is one of them is not affecting the other one significantly. So that's the job of the central bank. But I don't think that is a major problem as we have it now, because the key challenge for us in Nigeria today is to get into price stability. Because if we do not have stability and bring inflation down to about 11%, the economy cannot grow. So the correlation is quite clear. And if you look at the relationships in Nigeria over the last 20 years between high inflation and GDP growth, it's quite clear that when inflation is high, GDP growth is low. And like I told you earlier, when inflation was 9% in 2013, 2012, 2013, GDP growth was as high as 8.5%. So that correlation is very clearly defined.
All right, now let's look at something that's very important, which is revenue generation. And then, the elephant in the room, we might say, is revenue generation. And what is needed is a comprehensive revenue mobilization strategy. However, it would seem the government is sort of more fixated, I might be wrong, but it feels the government is more fixated on boosting tax enforcement and broadening the tax base. Let me get your thoughts on that, and then what you think about how Nigeria should go about this, really.
Well, I'm not a spokesperson for the government, so I think it's important you clarify that, and then you can ask the government people why they're taxing. And I think I've made my own stance clear on the cybersecurity tax, which I think the government has wisely withdrawn from that process. So I think they have a committee that is looking at harmonization of taxes. So I think they should let that committee come out with their report first, before we start taking a look at taxes, because there's a presidential committee on tax reform, fiscal and tax reform. So let's see what that committee comes up with. In terms of revenues, because of the devaluation, actually, government has had more revenues on their hands. And I think you can see that they have been looking at 2 trillion now on a monthly basis. Delta State now collects 38 billion every month. Lagos State collects 24 billion. And I think right now they're sharing about 1 trillion amongst themselves, and the government still has 1 trillion naira to take care of the statutory allocations and the rest of its debt service obligations. So government is on course to hit about 24 trillion in revenues this year. And of course, because of the devaluation of the naira, they're getting 1 naira for each dollar. As opposed to when it was 800 or 600 naira, now they're getting about 1,200, 1,300. So that's helping the government in that regards. So other areas of revenue generation is really oil production, and I think that's really where the focus should be, because our oil production has gone down significantly. In 1977, Nigeria was producing 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. Today, we're only doing about 1.3 million barrels a day. And really, that is where the problem is. If we can get our oil production back to 2 million barrels a day, things will ease the government.
All right, thank you so much. Tilewa Adebajo, CEO, CFG Advisory Limited. Thank you for your thoughts on the show today.
Good morning.